is Dr. Ray Juzaitis, who is a nuclear engineer with more than 40 years of experience. And he has worked in a number of areas, including nuclear weapons management, nuclear nonproliferation, intelligence, counterterrorism, homeland security, and related R&D programs. Dr. Juzaitis grew up outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He received his BSc in chemical engineering from the University of from Princeton University, and then earned his master's and PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Virginia. Ray's early career focused on computational physics, broadly in the areas of nuclear weapons design, testing, and development. During his career, he worked on a number of U.S. government programs at the Pentagon, as well as the defense program of the DOE. In the 1990s, he was the leader of the X Division at Los Alamos National Lab, which is the weapons design division. And he there was responsible for the transition from a testing-based culture to a more simulation-based culture, science-based stockpile stewardship. Ray served as a senior member of both the U.S. Nuclear Weapons Physics Laboratories, having also served at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory as the Associate Director for Nonproliferation, Homeland, and International Security. Following his retirement from Livermore, from the University of California, he served as a professor and department head of the Nuclear Engineering Department at Texas A&M. And after that, he was the president and CEO of National Securities Technology in Las Vegas, Nevada, which was the M&O contractor for the Nevada National Nuclear Security, Nevada National Security Site, or what used to be known as the Nevada Test Site. Since he has continued his research in areas involving technology and policy for proliferation, nuclear weapons, and related nuclear weapons and related national security interests.
Thank you. I guess my observation is among all these scientists, along comes an engineer. So in fact, you will not see any science in these few graphs. But what you will see is a struggle to understand, to reconcile, the nature of what we in the nuclear weapons program did or continue to do, and our faith and the teachings of our church in terms of, as Father John said, making the world a better place. Sometimes it's hard to see how what we do makes the world a better place. We can rationalize it. We can compartmentalize our lives so that our faith life and our professional life don't interfere with each other, sort of a duality. But to me, and I'm sure many others who are Catholics working at the laboratory, it is important to reconcile the morality of what we do, and hopefully find sustenance in papal teaching and the church's guidance on a subject that is really a difficult one. So first of all, starting at the beginning, we look for guidance in Revelation as told in the Bible, and we see in the book of Exodus that there's something that seems a little incongruous. There clearly is a directive that thou shalt not kill, but there's also a lot of talk about God being a warrior and a champion of warriors. If you read the Old Testament, as I'm sure you all are familiar, a lot of stories about justifiable war and pretty gruesome war. In this quote from Exodus 15, the Lord is a warrior. You sent out your fury, it consumed them like stubble. Terror and dread fell upon them. Sounds like nuclear weapons to me. More Bible and Catholic and references in the Catholic Catechism are available for guidance. The Catechism declares that human life is sacred, clearly because God alone is the Lord of life from its beginning until its end. But in the story of Cain and Abel, Scripture reveals that the presence of anger and envy leading to violence and death and murder are consequences of original sin, which have existed from the beginning of human history, which makes it a difficult proposition to say, how are we going to conquer our propensity to war and violence? The Church also teaches that we have a right to legitimate defense. Legitimate defense follows from the principle of double effect. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Legitimate defense follows from the principle of double effect, where in defending myself against an aggressor, if I save my life and kill the aggressor, I have done one thing that is good, one that is intended, namely preserve my life, and the other that was not intended, but in isolation would be considered to be a bad thing to do. Moreover, the Catechism proposes that it's actually a grave duty for someone who is responsible for another's life, like families, like countries, like tribes, to render any unjust aggressor unable to inflict harm, and offers the right to repel by armed force aggressors against the community in their charge. So, some of these conflicting principles were actually reconciled and consolidated in church teaching under St. Thomas Aquinas with the development of the just war theory. Thomas Aquinas' work builds on Augustine, who wrote in the 5th century, and Thomas, who wrote in the 13th century. And he basically identified two sets of principles for conducting war. One set of principles was called jus ad bellum, which means how do I act or think, or how do I seek justice before the war? What reflections do I do before I go into battle? And he identified 4 basic principles. Number 1, there has to be a just cause. And usually that cause is self-defense. And in fact, Pope Pius XII in 57 basically said that that is the only cause that is defensible. Second, it must be declared by a proper authority. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry can go and declare war. Usually it takes somebody who speaks for the community that they are protecting to do that. It must be an action of last resort. Talk first, negotiate, use diplomacy, use logic, try to engage with your enemy. However, if that doesn't work, then you need to go on. And the war has to be conducted with right intention, which means promote good and avoid evil, usually trying to get more good out of the evil that you do. Observe moral limits when you find yourself in a defensive war, and restore peace and justice as soon as you can. Don't wait along. Don't wait around. The second set of principles, jus in bello, elaborates on the principles that you would observe in the conduct of war. The war must be fought in a discriminate manner, Therefore, avoid collateral damage to non-combatants and otherwise innocents. Therefore, prefer military targets and armies, as your legitimate targets. The means that you use to wage war must be proportional to the ends to be achieved. And that also follows sort of from the principle of double effect. The scope of the conflict must be limited, and you should make sure that the good that you're trying to achieve is greater than the evil that you have to do to achieve it. Basically, jus in bello, in a nutshell, is a guidance to maintain moral control when at war and conclude that war as soon as possible. Now, fast forward to, so that was the 13th century. I'm sure the just war worked really well for knights, and maybe when the longbow was invented, it started to break down. But the just war basically did encapsulate a very timely and persistent teaching of the church. The question is, what happens after 1945 when we have introduced the nuclear weapon and World War II? Because even though the damage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was well described as being horrific, the conventional arms that were used and the way that they were used during World War II, in particular the strategic bombing campaigns against the saturation bombing of cities like Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo, and starting firestorms in cities. Those weren't all too gentle either. So nuclear weapons have to be taken into that context. But one thing we did know when we left that field of battle, so to speak, that the scope and destruction of wars had to be completely redefined from what historically had been. And so when nuclear weapons were introduced into the United States stockpile, the strategy for their use was governed by something called mutual assured destruction, a lot of times called MAD. MAD and mutual assured destruction are frequently misunderstood as being equated to how you use nuclear weapons. MAD was a strategy in use at a fixed point in time in the history of nuclear weapons, namely when you had a small number of weapons because we weren't able to produce enough of them. And, oh, by the way, after 1952 and the invention of the hydrogen bomb, those smaller number of weapons had huge explosive yields. So what kind of a strategy can we fit to those kind of instruments of destruction? Well, MAD was the answer, developed by Thomas Schelling and Herman Kahn in the 50s and 60s. Herman Kahn was a RAND analyst, and MAD goes something like this. The nuclear force of one side must be able to survive a first strike by an adversary and have enough weapons left over to be able to annihilate the adversary's homeland completely, which means targeting specifically population centers and industrial centers. And usually it was envisioned that this would take place in a fairly short amount of time in what I call a spasmodic exchange of nuclear arsenals. So, the planners of those days thought that was an appropriate, use of nuclear weapons, one that really provided enough deterrent capability for the country to deter the use of weapons against us by Russia. But more than that, the fact that you have this MAD, exchange provided a tractable calculus. It's a two-party a two-body problem for you physicists. It's a two-body problem of deterrence, which is a lot simpler, than if you had more than two bodies. And the fact that you would be annihilating each other allowed itself to have a tractable calculus developed, and game theory was applied. The tractable calculus was, actually resulted in having metrics. Robert McNamara in the 1960s had defined for their wargaming, what does it mean to annihilate the adversary's homeland? So, get enough weapons to do that, protect them, and you're good. So it was 30%, destroying 30% of a population and 50% of the nation's industry. Those were used to determine how fast, our arsenal should grow. Well, the principles of MAD were basically morally warped. It was absolutely in contradiction to the principles of the just war theory, and definitely conflicted with church teaching. For example, you're going to protect your retaliatory nuclear forces. The important thing is to have enough to hit them back with. But you won't defend your population because you want your population to be vulnerable so they can be annihilated. Counter-value targeting, which means specific targeting of populations, industry, and commerce, was to be preferred over counterforce targeting. Counterforce targeting is hitting only military, try to disarm your adversary. Again, I would call that morally backward. In fact, it led to ballistic missile defenses being abandoned because ballistic missile defenses would be there to protect your population. Well, we want the population to be vulnerable. So we'll take away civil defense, so we'll take away, the ABMs, which is the origin of the ABM Treaty. War-fighting forces were to be avoided in lieu of maintaining vulnerability to a retaliatory strike. In response to this kind of strategy by the United States, St. Pope John XXIII issued an encyclical in 1963 called Pacem in Terris. He issued that following the Cuban Missile Crisis to address issues of war and peace in the nuclear age. And what came out of that was a very nuanced statement, preserving the non-duality of trying to allow for self-defense and yet try to put a limit on destruction and killing. And he did say, we really eventually want to abolish our nuclear weapons. However, there is a process that needs to be gone through. The process has to be complete and thorough and needs to proceed from the inner conviction that everyone sincerely cooperated to banish the fear and anxious expectation of war with which men are oppressed.
Ray, you have a slide on this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you much. That's the quote. Which, the fact that he addresses the consequences of original sin and acknowledges the fact that abolition can't take place immediately, but needs to follow a process which also involves the development of the human heart. And ultimately, the true and solid peace of nations consists not in the equality of arms, but in mutual trust alone. So this was totally consistent with church teaching. Oh, it had to be. It was the Pope. Quickly after John the 23rd, Vatican II issued Gaudium et Spes as one of its documents in 1965, which also addressed the nature of nuclear weapons and the need to address them with a completely new attitude. It reiterated the right of government to self-defense. It agonized over the horrors of war, especially with the use of weapons of mass destruction, especially massive and indiscriminate destruction, and condemned, basically mad, indiscriminate destruction of entire cities as a crime against God. And that they did, though, they introduced the operational use of the word deterrence in church teaching for the first time, which basically said nuclear weapons are stockpiled not just for using them, but they are stockpiled to really deter an enemy attack. And if you can, and so it's justified to use them to deter that attack. But ultimately, the foundation for a sustainable peace has to be moving from peace, which results from fear, namely deterrence, to a peace that evolves from love and brotherhood, which is the desired endpoint. Fast forward now from the 60s to the 1980s. I think most of you were around in the 1980s to realize that there was a major nuclear freeze movement going on, partly in response to the election of Ronald Reagan and his very strong attitudes towards the Soviet Union, but also because the United States was intending to deploy a new class of nuclear weapons, intermediate nuclear forces. These are ballistic missiles with intermediate ranges in Europe, again, to balance what the Soviets had done in some of their forward deployments of their weapons. So in the midst of all this, St. Pope John Paul II addressed the UN General Assembly in 1982, and there again he reaffirmed the clear and consistent teaching of the Catholic Church was that the arms race is to be deployed, and there needs to be a mutual, progressive, and verifiable reduction of arms. So he understood again this process of abolition as a process, not as an immediately achievable end state. But St. John Paul II very well understood the moral evil of totalitarianism. So he regarded deterrence as conditionally acceptable morally. And the conditionality comes from the belief that deterrence is not an end in itself, but it's only a step on the way towards progressive disarmament. The only realistic response to the threat of war is negotiation. And he linked the goal of disarmament to the goal of human development. Basically, unless we seek justice in the world and eliminate significant inequalities, we are going to be faced with this problem for a long, long time. And the best encapsulation of John Paul II's statement was, to the extent that the efforts at arms reduction and then of total disarmament are not matched by parallel ethical renewal, they are doomed in advance to failure. In the same time period, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops published a very well-researched, reasoned, and articulated document called The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. They issued that in 1983, and 3 drafts were presented, over their deliberations, and they solicited input from everywhere. So it was an open, transparent process, and it reflected significant evolution from the first draft to the last. The overarching principles were that, yes, nuclear war threatens the existence of our planet. Catholic teaching has a presumption against war and for peaceful settlement of dispute. But again, nations have the right and duty to defend themselves against unjust aggression. They condemned indiscriminate destruction, and they condemned exceeding the limits of proportionality, all of which are brought into question by the use of nuclear weapons. Deterrence was regarded as a process, not just an aspiration. It was a step on the way to disarmament, and the bishops admitted that it's not an adequate strategy as a long-term basis for peace, mostly because it was based on fear and not necessarily love and brotherhood. Not necessarily, not at all. So they also encouraged disarmament via negotiations. I'll skip this one. Not to be outdone by the bishops, Los Alamos scientists decided that call also came to them. And a large group, some in this room still remember that, met together in 1982 with an additional 40 meetings to study the bishop's letter and to offer their own perspectives. Response was directed at an early draft of the bishop's letter, and here are the major takeaways. Number one, we commented on deterrence, and what are the requirements for the deterrence? Deterrence must be, number one, has to be credible. And the credibility flows from two things. One, technical credibility of the weapons in the stockpile, and second, the strength of will and commitment to use them if called to do so. We also applauded the recent presidential directive by Jimmy Carter, which was issued in the summer of 1980, called PD 59, and it moved the USA away from MAD and toward realistic planning for attacking militarily significant targets. So again, something to be applauded, based on the inconsistency of MAD with church teaching. We also rejected preemptive US first strike, rejected capitulation to totalitarianism, rejected unilateral disarmament, and supported a war-fighting nuclear deterrent, not a not a population targeting a nuclear deterrent, while pursuing arms reduction negotiations without conditions, right? Unconditionally negotiating. Again, things that we thought were derived from just war theory. Okay, so, and I wanted to say that Maury Pongratz has a PDF version of that document. I don't think it's on the internet anyway, but
I think Chris has it.
Yes. So then the question comes, has nuclear deterrence really had value? Is there something that you can say good about it? And in fact, if you look at the statistics, and this is one set of evidence that says, boy, they really did have an effect. This chart shows the worldwide fatalities in percentage of world population that came about as a result of, and this included civilian and military casualties, from wars that occurred in the time period of the graph. So the one, interestingly, with the highest percentage, 2.27, was 1600 to 1700, which is really centered around the 30 Years' War in Europe, in continental Europe, which was pretty much a bloody affair and motivated a lot by some religious issues. So, but then I would also point to World War II, which had quite a bit in a smaller time span. 1.75% of the world population was annihilated. But interestingly, after 1945 and from 1950 all the way over to 2000, in the Cold War, the fatalities went down to 0.4%. that were killed as a result of war. And since 2000, and I guess that's including the war on terror now, down to less than 0.01%. So it sure seems like deterrence has worked. The question, of course, is for how long can this take place? The other thing to observe, again, as we move through time, that nuclear weapons, we have responded as nations to the fact that when the war ends, get rid of some of those weapons. In fact, there was a considerable reduction. The blue curve there shows the US stockpile, which for your interest peaked in 1965, and then from there on was about the same or decreasing. The Soviets were a little behind. Their stockpile peaked in 1986, around the time that President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had their very historic discussions about the elimination of all nuclear weapons from the world. But more than that, it followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so really if you take, oh, and by the way, all those other proliferants, all those other nations that might have nuclear weapons, they are shown this little color, this little fattening of the baseline. Those include all, the rest of the P5 nuclear powers as well as the proliferants. So that since 1986, over 70,000 warheads were reduced to today to about 13,000, but not all of them are in stockpile, and I'll show you the breakdown. So the inventory of weapons includes those warheads that are deployed. They're on a short time fuse. They're on alert, first alert. Stockpiled weapons adds to that the non-deployed, but the spares and then the reserves of weapons that are located not very far from the launchers for the deployed weapons. Then you can add the retired warheads, which are warheads that have been retired and are awaiting dismantlement. So you add those up and you get the total inventory. So the total across the world around now is about 13,320. But notice that who still has most of the weapons? It's the United States and the Russian Federation, which together own 92% of all deployed weapons on Earth. But the emerging global security environment also significantly evolved since the early considerations, so since the 1980s and when the Cold War ended in 1991. So let's take a look at the threats as we see them now. The Russian Federation, after the Cold War ended, we thought they were going to be buddies. Remember the reset button? And, we once expected them to be strategic partners and less of an adversary. However, under Putin, they have increasingly presented a hostile posture towards the United States, and they wanted to reclaim world power status under a nationalist worldview, using their military prowess, not necessarily in economic terms. They increased their nuclear capabilities since then. They are modernizing their stockpile, and they abrogated the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty that was signed in 1986 before all the reductions began. In fact, the Russians have also used military force to occupy territory and change borders in Europe. This happened in Georgia, in Crimea, and is still happening in eastern Ukraine. China, on the other hand, is inching up as an adversary. It's gaining international world power status by virtue of its economic development, not necessarily at first its military prowess. But with economic development, You can also generate enough resources to modernize their strategic nuclear forces, and they're doing this, and they do it in an environment of opaqueness. There's very little that intelligence services do what they can, but they are very, very secretive about what they do. But we know that they have developed a new generation of mobile missiles, MIRV warheads, and they have developed an anti-satellite counter space capability, which is unprecedented because it was forbidden as of the 1963 test ban. And so they are becoming a geopolitical rival in East Asia. In the South China Sea, we know what they've been doing, and they pose a persistent threat to Taiwan and Okinawa. On the non-proliferation front, another area of threat, we witnessed a failure in North Korea of diplomacy. Korea now joins the nuclear nations outside of the non-proliferation treaty. We all know what's happened to the Iran deal. It's on ice, and it remains to be seen whether that's a permanent arrangement or not. However, Iran is definitely a latent nuclear weapons state, which also supports terrorist groups and continues missile development. Now, one factor is really important to think about the global security environment, and that is these rogue nuclear nations. They may not have a lot of nuclear weapons, but they can create regional proliferation cascades, meaning that if our allies who are dependent on the US nuclear umbrella don't feel confident that we would protect them when our friends are attacked, it is very clear that North Korea could easily provoke South Korea and Japan. Both of those countries have everything they need technically to have a nuclear deterrent. Iran, if it comes out with a real nuclear weapon, could provoke Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And the Russian threat, even though it's not a proliferator in Eastern Europe, if Germany loses its confidence that the United States will support it when it's attacked, Germany has the technical capabilities to develop a deterrent. And meanwhile, especially today when we honor those killed in the 9/11 attack, non-state actors actually may be undeterrable because they are fanatics and their actions are not considered with any sense of common good. Under Bush and Obama, in fact, the nuclear terror threat was considered to be the highest priority threat to the United States in its national security policy. And then another nuclear danger is state-assisted nuclear terror. This is when these very peaceful and loving countries of Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea offer some terrorists that they're supporting a nuclear weapon under the table, trying to evade attribution. Again, these are palpable dangers today. So, in light of this, and this is where a lot of our strategic thinking regarding the nuclear stockpile is today, that our nuclear posture must remain flexible and adaptable. Deterrence is going to have to do the job for a long period of time. Deterrence is going to have to wait out the change of heart in man. And deterrence has to be flexible because the nature of the threat will shift. What it takes to create fear, in one country or a terrorist or a adversary is not necessarily the same as what it would take to do. It was a lot easier when it was a two-body problem, as I said at the beginning. So the multipolar nuclear threat is a very difficult situation. You certainly can't use game theory very easily on that one. Our nuclear umbrella guarantees nuclear peace in Europe and East Asia. And as I said, confidence building needs to occur now because it's had a little bit of a dip. But loss of that guarantee would lead to more proliferation. So ballistic missile defense. Remember, under MAD, ballistic missile defense was considered an anathema because it didn't allow you to keep your population vulnerable. Today, ballistic missile defense plays a major role in defending against nuclear attacks from these rogue nations that don't have a lot of weapons, but as we see, North Korea develops an ICBM that can reach all parts of the continental United States. We must be able to deny rogue states and terrorists any success in what they would try to do, if possible. And the nuclear forces in response have to be shaped. So there will be changes when people read, oh, Los Alamos is developing a new nuclear weapon, or realize that this is done to try to maintain a strategic posture of deterrence vis-a-vis the current global threat. And the ability to shape, by the way, these nuclear forces is greatly limited by a test ban treaty that the United States is observing, along with a lot of other countries. And that test ban treaty basically shuts off fundamental development of technology and nuclear weapons. Now, there's other things that you can do to nuclear weapons to shape their effectiveness, safety, reliability, but you can't start inventing new Star Wars bombs or anything. And so this last takeaway here is that our nuclear forces back in the 1960s under MAD, there was only one thing those forces had to do, and that was to deter the Soviet Union. Today, in today's global security environment, they have to do four things. They have to deter our adversaries, assure our allies, dissuade the terrorists, and limit damage in case of a small nuclear attack. So we are not in the land of MAD anymore. Now, with all this change that has been going on, in the strategic world, strategic nuclear world, the Vatican, and this is my concern, the Vatican is now on a path to change its traditional church teaching with regard to nuclear weapons and deterrence. More and more, the Vatican, and I must say it is more under this Pope than JP2. JP2 didn't do it, but this Pope identifies more with the third world than with the first world. So in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, those of you who are familiar with the treaty realize that the world is divided into two kinds of powers: nuclear weapon states, of which there are 5, and non-nuclear weapon states, which there are over 40, the rest of them. And so the Vatican has adopted and is playing a political card. It's adopted an anti-first world bias, and and it's supporting third world positions. The Vatican also is discounting nuclear deterrence. We can all say that it's not good for forever, but discounting its value completely and saying that the architecture of nuclear deterrence has begun to crumble is simply not true. It bemoans the slow progress of nuclear powers toward disarmament obligations. That's correct. But you could also claim that changing the heart of man into love and brotherhood also is has shown very slow progress. So basically the takeaway is that the Vatican misunderstands the nuanced nature of nuclear deterrence in today's security environment. All of what I said at the beginning of the talk, the non-duality or non-dualism presented in church teaching, which said you have to live with two apparent contradictions. Can't kill, but you got to defend yourself. That is starting to drift towards duality. And in this sense, duality I have in mind, nuclear weapons are bad and have no value. Peace is good, but the two can't interpenetrate. You can't have nuclear weapons at peace, and you can't have, vice versa. It is instead proposing a global ethic of abolition. And this abolition is an essential, the Vatican claims, essential foundation of collective security. Realize the Vatican, when I speak about the Vatican here, it's not necessarily the Pope, although the Pope weighs in. The Holy See is actually a nation state under the United Nations. And if it wanted to, could behave very much like other nation states. So some of this is political posturing from a political standpoint. It claims that NPT regime has created a class structure in the international system. Well, we knew that. That was the design of the NPT. However, the view of the Vatican is that the nuclear weapon states are imposing their will on the rest of the world, and they're advancing their own interests. And then this argument about disarmament. If we disarm, we will result in the reallocation of funds to promote integral human development. To me, that's a little bit humorous. These are totally different time scales and totally different sets of consequences. The Vatican actually ratified the UN Prohibition Treaty in 2017. The UN General Assembly completed the Treaty on Prohibition in July of 2017, where it commits the signatories not to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, possess, or stockpile any nuclear weapons, which, to first order is a threat to those across the street over there, and us. The Holy See signed and ratified the treaty as a full state member in September of 2017, and the treaty actually went into force on January 22nd. Now, if you look at the wording of this treaty, and I encourage you to take a look on the internet, it is bare bones. There's nothing in it that says we don't like nuclear weapons, so we should get rid of them. There is no concept there is actually no guidance, moral guidance to those of us who live in the breach, to what you do between deterrence and abolition. This is a process and a progress. We should be doing negotiation all the time, but it sort of lacks the moral guidance that we as scientists need in this enterprise. Just to be more getting into the Vatican politics, the dicastery for promoting integral human development at the Vatican and the Holy See, it's an agency within the Holy See, organized an international symposium in November of 2017 called Perspectives for a World Free of Nuclear Weapons and for Integral Disarmament, and which became the platform and forum for the Pope's abolition announcement, which he stated pretty concisely here in November, in those days. I just highlight here the threat of their use, nuclear weapons, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned. Does that mean sinful? What do you say to the people who are involved in the enterprise? Yes, these weapons are in service of the mentality of fear and conflict, and the parties, but the nuclear weapons don't create anything but a false sense of security. So, I didn't show you that. And this is my concluding slide. Sorry, I probably took too long. Challenges going forward. In articulating its position, the Church did not seek any input from the laity, as was done by the bishops in 1982. The Holy See was mostly focused on its political role as a state in the United Nations. And the condemnation to the possession of nuclear weapons is predicated on political expediency rather than a rich exploration of the history of church teaching. I mean, it's not that the Holy See doesn't know what the history of church teaching is. It's the fact that it didn't rationalize or show why it came down with this breakaway condemnation and call for abolition. So what are the implications to us Catholic scientists, both civilian and defense and military professionals who are working in the U.S. nuclear weapons enterprise? You know, is the condemnation of nuclear weapons morally binding? You know, what do we do? Is it sinful? Pacifism is clearly a legitimate right for an individual, but we've always believed that it's not a legitimate option for a government, which follows from the just war theory. Is there an opportunity to invite deeper reflection and perhaps input to the Holy See? We don't know. The only takeaway I think we can have is to maintain our faith, and not faith in God, but our following of earlier church teaching, and really articulate the need for unconditioned arms control negotiations built on transparency and trust, which lead to verifiable agreements. And that is the way to build the trust that's necessary. It'll take a long time, but original sin lasts a long time too. So with that, thank you. Sorry for going a little long.
Maybe one quick question while we transition to the next speaker.
Yes.
You made a big point about the shifting towards something a little more just war-like, where you make the nuclear weapons aim at smaller targets, military relevant targets.
Right.
And that's basically saying a push toward tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Tactical nuclear weapons have smaller impacts and are therefore less likely to have a threshold which would prevent people from using it and make it more likely to be usable. And
That's the counter argument.
yes.
However, in the defense, when you look at the kinds of conflicts that they might be used in, you have to consider the fact that the United States may have to use a nuclear weapon, and it is using nuclear weapons to deter a conventional attack on the eastern front of Europe. And that's still going on. That's the deal we have with Germany, the Baltic states. You don't want to have nothing but multi-megaton weapons in that case. So a more complete strategy of deterrence, which brings in extended deterrence in how we work with our allies, would provide the argument for why you need technical, but you also need to be able to shut the valve off, you know, if you believe it can be done. There are many who say that once you fire the first one, it's just going to, no matter your best intent,
Right.
it'll end up in a spasmodic exchange of arsenals. So that's the, yes.
It might be worse than you said. You said 5 nuclear states. I count 8 if you include Israel, who is not ruled out first strike against Iran if Iran were to get nuclear weapons.
I cannot comment on anything about Israel's capabilities. As you saw, I surgically took care of it.
Let me get one more question.
Yeah.
So, and if the answer to this is classified, please don't answer it. But in your experience, how much did earlier church teaching or even the Los Alamos scientists study on nuclear weapons? Did any of this affect those in the nuclear enterprise and their moral considerations, or our leaders and they're developing their strategies for deterrence, reduction, and all of this?
Well, the only thing I can speak for is the little group of us that worked on the response to the bishops. And I think for all of us, it was an extremely valuable educational process. And for me personally, it made all the difference. I mean, I have 40 years in this business, and I didn't want to sit for 40 years with a sense of guilt. You know, so, and that's why I look to the church's teaching to give me the confidence I need that, you know, I'm doing something important. You know, the thing I worry about is this compartmentalization. You know, we were talking about it earlier. What, you know, do scientists at the lab, and this is a generic statement, like to talk about their faith? Probably not in a professional setting or even at lunch. You know, there is a certain element of compartmentalization that, you know, what they should do is come join the SCS, you know, and then have a wonderful opportunity. But I think, Chris, the moral issues, you know, in all of my leadership, you know, nobody ever talked about it. You know, you just leave it to that. But I felt a lot better for having done it. And I felt, you know, and I think a lot of people look at the abolition announcement and condemnation as, oh, you know, that's flavor of the month and tomorrow. I look at it with alarm because I see it as a major change in how, I mean, it undercuts my belief in what I'm doing, you know, in the correctness, the moral correctness. You know, I want to be building the world better.
Will Lori will cheer us up and tell us how